Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another EVE virtual repair video. I am Michael, your host, and today we're going to take a look at a laptop cleaning. Now, this is one of the services that we provide, and I always stress it to our customers, especially ones that have older laptops. Over time, the cooling system in the laptop doesn't perform as well as it should. It begins to overheat, and you end up with all sorts of other problems coming because of it. So this particular computer actually has a lot of issues, and the overheating could be caused for some of them, but not necessarily all of them. The computer was running very, very slowly, was giving corrupt file errors, so it just had all sorts of issues. So I have the hard drive out. Before we do any work inside a computer, I always take the battery out because we don't want to accidentally turn it on, and the hard drive, just in case we're moving this around, we're shaking it and whatnot. We don't want, especially the mechanical hard drives, the solid state, it really doesn't matter, but we don't want those banging around and everything. So we always take that out. It's in another system right now, run some diagnostics, a surface scan and all, just to make sure the drive is performing the way it should. But the customer states that when she brings this computer outside on her porch to do work on it, it starts to slow down to a crawl. And that makes me believe that the processor is beginning to overheat and it's throttling itself to prevent it from getting to the point where it could actually cause permanent damage to the processor itself. So I always stress these cleanings to the customer, but unfortunately, like everything, if they don't see the value in it, they have a very difficult time justifying any cost for it. And for laptops, I charge $60 to do this because oftentimes you have to take virtually the entire system apart to gain access to the processor itself. In this particular case, this is an eMachine Gateway model ML6721, and this actually is a little bit easier to work with, but $60 regardless. We're going to replace the thermal compound on the processor, and this is very important because typically when you take a computer to your big box retailer and you say, I need it cleaning, they'll clean the screen, they'll wipe down the keyboard, and they'll take their little can of dust off and they'll blow it inside there, and they'll say, you know what, job done. But the fact of the matter is, if you use your can of dust off and you're blowing into the computer, you might get some dust spraying out the bottom or the side depending on which direction you're pointing it at, but a lot of it goes back into the computer, and what ends up happening is you end up with a wall of dust between where the thermal pipe, which is what's transferring heat off the processor, and we'll see that shortly, and it can't get, and the fan is really doing absolutely nothing because there's this wall preventing it from getting at it properly. So that's typically what happens. They're not going to take your computer apart there. It's risky business for them. And this is something that, you want to know what you're doing before you even offer this to a customer. So with that said, this is not a particularly difficult one. So we're going to have some fun. I figure it'll be a shorter video just showing a repair. So the first thing that we know from this particular system is that it has a fairly large back plate. You can see it here, this huge thing here. And this is pretty much indicative of older Gateway and eMachine laptops where everything was accessible through the rear, which from a repair standpoint is great, especially for them. But it also meant that customers typically tried to do a lot of repairs themselves, didn't know what they were doing, and ended up damaging something. So there's 6 screws or so that we're going to unscrew on the back of this. And again, make sure you use the right screwdriver. Some people would say, will ask if you can use an electric screwdriver. You can when you're removing screws, but when you're putting them back in, you really want to hand tighten them because you don't want to over tighten the screw, because you could either strip the screw or crack the bezel, and any damage to the laptop while it's in your possession is going to ultimately end up costing you a lot more money. So we don't want to do that. So we'll just stick with the hand tool here, and then once you unscrew it, you end up with this giant back plate looking thing. So we'll set that on the side there. And now you can see we have access to the memory from here, and we see that there's the processor, and the fan is all accessible from this one back plate, which makes this repair very simple. Here's the processor here, and this is what I was talking about. This is the heat pipe. In a desktop system, this would be a giant hulking piece of metal sitting over the processor known as a heat sink, and there'd be a fan mounted on top of it or on the side, depending on what its orientation is inside the computer. And this heat sink transfers the heat off the processor and through it, and then the fan distributes it. Either it blows out, or in some systems it blows across the heat sink to cool the heat sink down. But there is a thermal compound, sometimes it's a pad, what they call a thermal pad, which fills in all the microscopic holes to make a nice smooth layer for the connection between the heatsink and the processor. Over time, this compound begins to dry out and it flakes away, and it no longer creates that nice tight seal that's required for this to distribute its heat properly. The thing that you have to realize is that because this system, if you've seen a desktop heatsink, you see how big they are, you see how massive they are. This system, because it's so small, is not going to be able to distribute the heat as well as that giant heatsink would. So you want to make sure, if anything, that this is performing as well as it can, because laptops generally run hotter than a desktop. The other issue with a lot of these laptop models is the fact that the fan, now this one will blow out the side here too, as you can see here. There's a grill here, but the fan is on the bottom, sucking air in, and then it spits it out the side. Or it'll do it the other way, depending on what its orientation is. The problem with this is that when this thing sits down, even though it has the little rubber feet here, they're intact. A lot of times these are missing. But because it has these rubber feet, it lifts it off the ground a little bit. But it's not getting the airflow under the computer that's really necessary to do well. And when she's outside, because it's already so hot and the ambient temperature is much hotter than outside than inside, that's where she's running into these overheating problems. I would venture a guess that this processor probably, even in a reasonably cooled room, we'll say around 68 to 74 or so, probably runs around 60 or so degrees Celsius. Now, in computer language, when we talk about processor heat, we usually always refer to it in Celsius, and there's just some correlation there. It's always been read. The rest of the world pretty much does Celsius. We do Fahrenheit. So it's easier when you're helping people. You just always do Celsius. So if you want to convert it, 60 degrees is well over 100 Fahrenheit. So it's probably somewhere around 105, 110, give or take. So that's pretty hot. AMD processors are certified for about 90 degrees Celsius before you really start to run into problems. But way before that, around 70 or so, 65, 70, it's all dependent upon the processor itself. It will begin an internal failsafe, pretty much, which will throttle the CPU. So if it's we'll just say a 1.6 gigahertz processor, it's going to downclock it. We'll say it'll start going to like 1.2, and it'll reduce the voltage to the chip in an effort to lower its internal temperature. And sometimes it can throttle it so much that it just slows the system down to the point where it's just not going to work anymore, and it's going to end up crashing or freezing or whatever the case may be. And that's what I suspect is going on with this system, but it's also possible that because of the overheating, it could have damaged something, because these things are known to catch fire. It has happened. It's definitely not something that should be taken lightly. And this is one of the things that we preach here is proactive maintenance. We're so connected to our mobile devices, our computers, we can't live without them. So to spend a little extra money and make sure the thing is going to last is important. So by making sure the computer is nice and clean, we're not going to have any overheating issues, hopefully, in the future. But the other thing to note is that extreme temperature changes, laptops especially, but electronics in general, don't respond too well to them. If you were, say, in a very cold room, you know, you had your air conditioning on, it's, we'll say 68 degrees, and then you run outside and it's 90 degrees with your laptop, you actually might start to get some condensation forming because of that. And as we all know, water, liquid in general, and electronics do not mix. So it's always something to keep in mind when you're outside with your laptop. You don't necessarily want to bring it in extreme heat, and you certainly do not want it in direct sunlight. So, with that all said, let's begin our disassembly of this. And this is actually really simple to disassemble. You have, let's see if we can get in close here. I apologize, I will have a webcam set up soon. But we have the fan connection to the motherboard is right there. We have there's 4 screws here. You'll probably only be able to see these 2. And they hold the brackets on to keep the heatsink making good solid contact with the processor. And there's 4 of them there. And then there's the other heat pipe that goes to the other chip right there. So we need to disassemble this entire thing, which is only 5 screws and a wire. And these screws are typically quite a bit smaller than your standard laptop screw, so you will want to make sure that you don't strip these. Make sure if you have to get a real tiny screwdriver that you do so, because you don't want to strip them. So we'll do this. And the other thing to note is, if you're using the correct screwdriver, you don't want to apply a lot of force onto the screw, because you don't want to push in on the motherboard too much, because you're going to apply pressure to the bottom, which is the LCD, and you don't want to crack that accidentally. And then this is just going to lift right out, and we can disassemble the fan from it. It's usually easier because you'll get a little bit of leeway with the cable to pull this out first and then just pop this out, because you don't, a lot of times people end up pulling up on the cable, and you don't want that either. So you always want to grab it as best you can from there, and you get a little bit better leeway from there. So this is a thermal pad. This is not thermal grease, as we call it. This is actually a pad, and this can get usually what you end up doing with it is scraping it off and then reapplying some actual thermal grease to it. And this is also a pad, but this one is like a really ghetto looking one, and you can see that it has definitely seen better days. That's where it was making contact with the processor, so you can see the rest of it is on the processor. And the fan actually, for the most part, looks like it's in fairly good condition. You can't see shit there, so we won't worry about that. So that's that. And then on a normal computer, the processor usually has a lever that you pull up and it unlocks it, and then you push it down and it locks it into place. On laptops, it's generally a screw that you have to turn to release the processor. So, in fact, I can probably show you that. That shouldn't be an issue. You can see it right here. There's the screw, and this just needs to get turned and it will release the processor. Otherwise, it's just going to, you don't want to pull up on this. These are all what they call zero insertion force, which means they can just be literally plopped in there, and you're not going to run into any issues with it. And then you pull the processor out, and that's what it looks like. Just put my hands all over the thermal compound there, but that's all right because it's a pad, and you can see the little bit of thermal grease that's left on there, or the thermal pad. We're going to place that processor on the side there on an anti-static bag so we don't rupture it. And then that's what the socket looks like for the CPU. Nothing major there. You know, this particular CPU is some kind of Intel. It's an Intel 1.6 gigahertz, 1 megabyte cache, 533 megahertz bus. And it is only a single core processor. Okay. So now we can look at the rest of the computer. I'm kind of curious how the memory is on this, because that could also be contributing to some of the slowdown in the computer. This is Samsung memory. It's DDR2 5300 megahertz. A 512 megabyte stick. So I'm going to guess that the second one is also a 512. And it is indeed. So it's only got 1 gigabyte of RAM. It's supposedly running Windows 7, although I couldn't tell you because it didn't boot. It's licensed for Vista, which is, let's just leave it at that. It's not a very good operating system. But this is what makes laptop cleaning fairly easy when you have a system that works like this. Unfortunately, they're not all like that. You're going to get plenty of computers that are not going to be that easy to do. So the next thing we have to do is you got this thermal pad on there which needs to be removed. And sometimes this can be a little difficult. I always use a fingernail on it to get the major pieces of it off, because you don't really want to scratch the surface of this if it can be avoided. And then we're going to use some alcohol and all to further clean that. So the first thing we're going to do though is get the big hunkers off. And it's really like dry and really caked on there. But a fingernail, to be honest with you, is probably your best bet just to clean this off. I hate these thermal pads. They're to me they're inefficient, but I guess for just the laptop it's all right. But I'm not particularly thrilled with them because they're a pain to get off. So we got the vast majority of it off though. That's good. Like I said, you want the big pieces off. And there's actually an indent where this thing was pushed in. It created a small indent in the copper here. Well, I'm assuming this is all copper. It's not just copper plated, but a lot of heat sinks you'll see are copper. They conduct heat a little bit better. Okay, and once we get all the big chunks off, then we're going to actually clean it. So, one thing you don't want to use, you'll see people using paper towels, you'll see people using toilet paper. No, you never want to use something like that because you don't want the little microfibers getting on the surface. Cotton balls work great, and you want to use some isopropyl alcohol. Now, there's some debate in the computer world, 98 or 99, 97% isopropyl. To be honest with you, I use 91. I've used 91 for 15 years, and I've never had anybody or anything go wrong with that. And we just want to clean this as best we can to get as much of the residue and all that was on there. And this part you can push, you want to push as hard as you can to really, without warping and bending the heat pipe, of course. But you want to push as hard as you can. And the more it squeaks, that means it's just squeaky clean. Go in all directions, make sure you're good to go here. Okay, and that actually looks pretty good. We'll clean the table there. Now, the processor you need to be very careful with. And I'll show you why. Because underneath it, you got all these little pins that are sticking out. When you're handling this thing, you got to handle it from the side. If you if you have to grab it for whatever reason in the middle, you hold it like that in the middle. If you really absolutely for whatever reason needed to do that, but always hold it in the sides, because if you got real fat fingers or something like that, it's very easy to bend these pins. And let me tell you, I've tried bending them back for people before who have done it, and it's not easy because they're very fragile. And when you try to bend them back, they always seem to bend, but then when you try to bend them back, sometimes they snap. So you always want to make sure that you handle it properly and handle it from the side. And we're going to go through the pretty much the exact same thing here. We're just going to try to get this off here, and there's like some hair on it and all. And that's exactly what you want to make sure is not on there. So we're going to get another cotton ball. And we're going to, I always, when I'm putting the processor down, if you're going to do it, you put it on an anti-static bag. Or since I'm going to clean it, I put it face down. Now, if the thermal paste is on there and it's wet, you probably don't want to do that because you don't want it all over your work area. But because there's no thermal grease on here, it's actually, as I mentioned, a pad. We'll just, and it might take a little while to get this off. You know, it might take a couple applications. You might, you know, because you can't really push in too hard on this without damaging it. So you really want to, you know, you might have to use a fingernail. Unfortunately, they don't make an easier way of doing this. I mean, this is really old and caked on there. Wow. Now you could let it sit for a bit too. That's what, you know, some people would do. They'd put it on there. You can apply it to like a cotton ball or something like that and just let it sit. But for the sake of this video, I want to get this, you know, I don't want to sit here for 25 minutes waiting for the thermal grease. So we will use a fingernail instead. Never use a screwdriver, a knife, anything like that. Now, some people also might say use nail polish remover, but I wouldn't use that either because that could actually loosen some of the other components on it. You know, it's very, very, very corrosive, so we don't really want to do that at all. Okay. Now we can see where the last vestiges of this thermal compound are. Ah, was that a mess or was that a mess? Okay. Just inspect the processor. It looks good, great, excellent. And then you can see there how nice and shiny that is. That's how you want it to look when you're done with it. Okay. And now that we're done, let's put this back on the baggie over here. Now, if you want to, you'll do the same thing with this. Because this is over the graphics chip, and there's no grease or anything like that on the other chip. It's nice and shiny. In fact, I can show you. Yeah. See that? Nice and shiny as well. So we don't really need to clean him. He's in good shape. But just for the sake of argument, we can just wipe him off. Make sure he's in good shape. Wipe off around that. Wipe it up. And one of the reasons you use alcohol is because it evaporates very, very quickly. And it doesn't leave a residue. Now, what does that say? don't know. Not important. All right. To put it back inside the system, it's the exact process, but in reverse. The only thing you have to be careful with is if you look at the bottom of this processor, you'll see right in the corner there, there's a tab. You got a couple pins missing. That's by design so that you don't put it in backwards. So you line the tab up with where it is on the socket, which you probably can't see, but it is right at the bottom there. And it will literally plop down into place. If it doesn't plop down into place, you got a problem. So we'll always make sure that we got it right. And then you just very gently go plop and plop. And he's right where he should be. So then we're going to tighten it back up. Let me flip this over. I don't work too well in reverse because I always want to remember which way I turned it originally. And now it's locked back into place. He's sitting right there. And we are going to apply some new thermal paste. We're going to use thermal paste. This is Arctic Silver 5. It's one of the better thermal greases that you can get. You know, we're not looking to use any BS here. Now, the key when applying this is you're not icing a cake here. You want a very, very tiny amount. You know, you really like, seriously, a drop. So you can see there, my little drop in the middle. Now, some people would say you're supposed to spread this. Some people say you're not. I always believe it's best to let the computer spread it. And what'll happen is when you attach this, it'll squish it out. And then as it heats up, it will begin to form a nice seal to it. Usually takes, you know, a number of hours for what they call the burn-in or whatever for it to take effect fully. But that's what you're looking to do. And then all we got to do is reattach everything. So we got our fan header. We got to put that back into place. One of the good things is if you have small hands, which I have thin hands, I don't necessarily have small hands, but it really helps when you're trying to do some of this stuff. And then you place everything back on top. And then we just got to screw her back in. And with these, again, you don't want to over tighten them. You want to make sure they're tight, but you don't want to be, you know, drilling these in. So that's why it's never a good idea to use an electric screwdriver. Some people will, but I always prefer to do it by hand. That way you can really tell if how much pressure you're applying. And then this little guy over here. Okay, and I think we're good. Now, the reason I didn't clean this fan is because the fan is actually in a really, really good shape. There's not much that I could do to that to make it any cleaner. So the only thing that it has is a little bit of dust on the outside. Actually, it has more dust on the outside than it does the inside. So we don't even have to go into that. There is virtually no dust in this fan whatsoever. I mean, that is amazing that it's that clean, but it happens. However, the thermal compound was old and disgusting, so we got rid of that. Just make sure everything is hooked up, and then we're going to put the back piece back on. And in some instances, these can be a little bit of a pain in the rear, just because of their general shape. You know, you just want to take your time. Make sure it's lined up as best as it can. Because you got to kind of bend the pieces into place, and then you start screwing them down. Now, unfortunately, because the computer didn't work, as far as booting an OS, I can't do it before and after as far as the temperatures are concerned, but you're not really going to get massive differences. You'll get some, it could be 5, 7, 8 degrees Celsius, but you're not gonna go crazy with it. However, if it was really, really bad and not functioning properly, it could be the difference between it working and not working. So it's always, people think, well, that's only 8 degrees Celsius, but it's a big difference. So we're all tightened up here. Now I don't have a battery in here, so we will use the power cord here, which gotta make sure we use the right one. That would be very, very bad if we didn't. Make sure it's plugged in. It is. And we gotta find the hook, which is in the back. Nope. There we go. We'll turn this puppy on. And if all goes well, it'll boot. And there we go. Gateway backwards. What are we gonna do? And it has no hard drive installed, and obviously I don't have this set up for a Pixie boot. So that's basically what we're looking at here. So that's a computer cleaning in and of itself. It's not too bad. Sorry about the crude iPhone recording. We'll be working on that soon too. But that's a computer cleaning. And that took, 32 minutes. That's with me babbling a little bit. But, it's involved. This was an easy one because you can access it from the bottom. A computer that you can't access from the bottom, where you got to literally take the whole bezel off and everything, requires a lot more work. So that's why it costs a little bit more. But the bottom line is, guys, if you're going to have your computer, you plan on having your computer for more than a couple of years, you really need to have routine maintenance done on it. It's no different than anything else, a car. So for a little bit of money, get it done. So this is our laptop cleaning video. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great day and take care.